A chasm in the earth, the scent of laurel and sulfur. Somewhere beneath the stone bones of Mount Parnassus, a single breath rises, a breath that is not quite of this world. It curls like incense from the cracked mouth of the earth itself, rising to touch the lips of a woman seated above. She is veiled in linen, cloaked in ritual, and watched by the unblinking gaze of gods and kings alike. Her body sways, her mouth opens, and the future trembles. Long before the empires of men crowned themselves with certainty, there was this place, Delphi. Not merely a city or shrine, but the omphalos, the navel of the world, where heaven met stone and questions met silence. The temple built here bore no armies, commanded no ships, and yet it ruled minds. For in the cella of Apollo's sanctuary sat a woman, the Pythia, whose words could seal destinies with a whisper. She was not a queen. She wore no gold, carried no scepter. And yet, generals crossed oceans for her counsel. Emperors paused wars, waiting for her breath to steady. Her throne was a three-legged stool, her palace, the smoke-laced hollows of the temple. Her crown, the voice of Apollo himself, descending through the vaporous cleft in the rock. But who was she really? Beneath the marble and myth, something more ancient stirs. Long before the god Apollo claimed Delphi as his domain, this place belonged to a deeper power. A serpent, they said, a primordial spirit, called Python, coiled in the womb of the earth. It was here, in the sanctuary of Gaia, that the first whispers were heard, not in thunderous revelation, but in slow, dreamlike utterances that came from beneath. Earthborn, woman-led, trance-spoken. This was no later Hellenic oracle, polished by philosophy and law. This was mystery in its rawest form, shamanic, terrifying, feminine, and yet even that was overtaken. The myths tell of Apollo, youthful and bright, descending with radiant violence to slay the old dragon, claiming the navel of the world for his own. From that conquest, the oracle was reborn, now a tool of the Olympians, the voice of a male god spoken through the body of a woman. But the old power never left. It only learned to hide behind new names. The woman chosen to channel the god was no mystic wanderer. She was selected, trained, and guarded. She fasted on laurel leaves, bathed in the sacred spring, and entered the inner chamber alone. As she sat above the fissure in the rock, breathing in the divine fumes, her consciousness wavered, drifting into a trance state where the boundaries between self and God dissolved. Her voice changed, her limbs quaked, and what emerged from her mouth was not language as we know it, but fragments, riddles, sounds, phrases shaped by forces unknown. Priests surrounded her, listening, interpreting, translating. But the power did not belong to them. It flowed through her. And it was her body, not theirs, that bore the tremor of prophecy. She was both medium and message, vessel and veil, a human threshold standing at the edge of unknowable truth. But what truth was she channeling? Was it Apollo who spoke, or something older, deeper, darker? Was the divine madness that seized her truly sacred, or was it a rehearsed performance cloaked in incense and ritual? Historians have argued, skeptics have scoffed, scientists have speculated. Volcanic gases, hallucinations, mass psychosis. Yet none of these explain why her words shaped the course of nations. None explain why thousands across centuries believed, feared, obeyed. Perhaps the answer lies not in what she said, but in what she embodied. She was the embodiment of the question itself, the hunger to know, the ache for certainty in an uncertain world. And in her trembling voice, cloaked in vapor, the world heard not answers, but mirrors. And that ache has never left us. It lingers still, in the eyes of those who stare too long into flames, in the silence before decisions that alter lives, in the trembling moment before we ask what we already fear to hear. The Pythia did not invent prophecy. She simply made the unbearable bearable. By clothing doubt in divine language, she transformed panic into process, chaos into cosmos. The oracle was not only a voice, it was a ritual, a framework for surviving the void. To enter Delphi was to step out of time. Pilgrims came from every city-state, crossing seas, mountains, deserts. They waited for days, sometimes weeks. They carried offerings, golden statues, crafted weapons, sacred oils. But beneath all these gifts lay the true currency, a question, always a question. And sometimes that question was everything they had. Not everyone was permitted to ask. The priests chose carefully. The supplicant had to be ritually pure, and their offering sufficient. And then, if the omens aligned, if the birds flew right, if the smoke curled properly, if the sacred lot was drawn, the moment came. They were led into the presence of the god's vessel. No one ever forgot that moment. Inside the temple, beneath the towering columns and fading frescoes, behind the curtain of incense, the air grew dense. The stone pulsed with an unseen rhythm. And from within the adyton, the inner sanctum, the sound emerged. At first it was low, like the earth exhaling. Then came her voice, not loud, not shrill, but strange, layered, as though more than one presence spoke through her. The Pythia's words came jagged, broken, drenched in metaphor. Yet behind them surged something ancient, not logic, not instruction, something closer to poetry, the kind that shatters, then rebuilds. The priests would then step in, smoothing the jagged edges. They translated, paraphrased, polished. What left the adyton as a sacred utterance emerged into the sunlight as an official decree. And so the oracle guided cities to war, lovers to betrayal, kings to ruin, and salvation. But beneath the marble facade of divine order, something uneasy coiled. There are stories, old, rarely told, of Pythias who broke the pattern, who went too deep, stayed too long in the trance, who screamed, convulsed, refused to speak in riddles. Stories of bodies that trembled for hours, of eyes that never returned from wherever they had gone. The priests called these failures, excesses, errors of procedure. But the people whispered differently. They said these women had seen too much, that they had gone beyond the reach of even Apollo. Was it madness? Or was it revelation too raw for words? And why must the divine always be mediated? Why must the voice of a god be cleaned, filtered, softened by male hands, before the world may hear it? Perhaps the real reason for the oracle's power was not Apollo at all. Perhaps it was the woman beneath the god, a body tuned to the tremors of the earth, a psyche pierced by the fears of an entire civilization. Perhaps she did not speak for the divine, but for something even more dangerous, the collective unconscious. Because every question brought to Delphi was a mirror held to the soul of a people. What should we do? They asked. But what they really meant was, who are we? And the Pythia answered, not with facts, not with certainty, but with words that forced reflection. Her riddles disoriented, yes, but they also awakened. They revealed the assumptions beneath the question, the cost of desire, the echo of doubt. And so, in decoding her prophecies, supplicants had to confront themselves. She was the embodiment of the question, and the question was always, what will you choose now? But choices were rarely simple. In Delphi, ambiguity was sacred. A straight answer would bind the future too tightly, leaving no room for the will of gods or men. Instead, the oracle spoke in paradox. You will go, you will return. Not in war shall you perish. A riddle of placement. Was it a promise or a warning? The ambiguity was deliberate. It forced the listener to listen inward, to carry the burden of interpretation, to become, in a way, their own oracle. For in the end, prophecy was never about foreseeing. It was about revealing. The Pythia held a mirror to the soul, not to show what would happen, but to illuminate what already stirred within. Kings who feared betrayal heard omens of treachery. Warriors hungry for glory heard promises of victory. The oracle simply whispered back what the seeker already knew, or feared, or denied. Her power was not in prediction. It was in reflection. And yet Delphi was not only a temple of the soul. It was also a theater of politics. Behind the veils and vapors, powerful interests gathered. The priests who interpreted the oracle wielded immense influence. They were diplomats, mediators, gatekeepers of divine will. They maintained archives of past prophecies, crafted genealogies, and advised city-states. Their interpretations could justify war, endorse rulers, quell rebellion. Slowly, subtly, the oracle became a tool, not just of the gods, but of men who claimed to speak for them. Still, the Pythia remained central. Even as the priests curated her words, they could not invent her trance. Her shaking hands, her glossed eyes, the low, strange voice, these were not theater. They were something real, something ancient. The ritual held its power because her body bore it. She was not acting. She was entering. And whatever she met in that sacred dark was not always Apollo. There are reports, scattered, fragmented, of visions that defied doctrine, of utterances that terrified the priests, prophecies that disrupted plans, moments when the oracle seemed to slip from their grasp. In those moments, the Pythia was not a symbol or a servant. She was sovereign. Who were these women? Contrary to popular belief, the Pythia was not always a virgin or a young girl. Over time, the role shifted. Some were older women, chosen for their dignity, wisdom, or devotion. They were drawn from the local population, sworn to purity, then inducted into mystery. Their names were often lost, consumed by the title. Pythia was not a person, but a mask worn by many. A sacred role passed down across centuries, each woman disappearing into the voice she came to carry. And what did it mean to carry that voice? To become the mouth of a god was not a gift. It was a surrender. The Pythia gave up family identity, safety. Her trance state left her vulnerable. Some accounts describe trembling, frothing collapse. Her health often declined. Her mind drifted. She lived in liminality, between self and other, sanity and madness, woman and deity. And yet, she was revered, feared, protected. She stood at the center of the world's great questions and bore the cost of being their vessel. Still, across the centuries, she returned. One woman after another, different names, same title, different bodies, same trembling breath above the chasm. What called them into the smoke? Perhaps it was power, perhaps it was purpose, but perhaps, most deeply, it was the same question that brought kings to their knees, a longing to touch the divine, to hear, even once, the voice behind the silence. Because beneath all power lies uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, the oracle waited, veiled, breathing, listening. But who was listening back? The myth tells us that it was Apollo, golden-haired and radiant, god of music and logic, prophecy and plague. It was he who claimed the temple, who slew the serpent, who granted his voice to the Pythia. That is what the stories say. But myths often hide more than they reveal. And if we look closer, the light begins to bend. The site at Delphi was sacred long before Apollo's name was carved into stone. In the earliest layers of memory, this was a place of earth worship, a site of the Great Mother, Gaia, the ground itself, a place where priestesses murmured to the land, and the land spoke back. The vapors, the trance, the vision, all were part of a ritual older than Olympus, older than the sky gods, older perhaps than speech itself. So what does it mean that Apollo, a young male deity, arrived and took the site by force? He did not inherit Delphi, he conquered it. The killing of Python, the guardian serpent of the chthonic goddess, was not merely a mythic drama. It was a cultural rupture. The old feminine powers of instinct, earth, and mystery were overwritten by the new masculine order of clarity, control, and hierarchy. The Pythia remained, but she no longer spoke for herself or for Gaia. She now spoke for Apollo, and the rift that split the oracle's temple ran deeper than stone. From this twist, a paradox was born. The Pythia, a woman, was made to channel the voice of a male god who had violently silenced the feminine principle she once served. Her trance, once a communion with the earth, became a sanctioned possession. She was still sacred, still feared, but she was also controlled, interpreted, surrounded by men who shaped her utterances to serve political ends. And yet, something resisted. Despite the layers of ceremony, despite the scrolls and marble and dogma, the old voice sometimes leaked through. In the way her body writhed, in the dreams she recalled, in the strange, ancient phrasing that no priest could translate. There are fragments of early accounts that describe her not just as possessed, but as possessing, filled with a force that turned the watchers pale, that made even the high priests uneasy. They called it mania, divine madness.
But what if it was memory? What if, within that trembling body, the earth still spoke? Not in words, but in convulsion, in dream symbols, in fragments too wild for scripture. What if, even as Apollo's name was chanted, the Pythia remembered what had come before and called it back? That possibility terrified the powers of the day, for to admit it was to admit that beneath their clean geometry lay a wound, a history of suppression, a buried goddess. And the oracle, that veiled woman on the tripod, sat directly above the crack. She did not just speak prophecy. She embodied the tension between two worlds, the world of logic and empire, and the world of dream and root and blood. She was the bridge, and sometimes the battlefield, between them. And every time she inhaled the vapor, every time her body twisted and her voice fractured, that ancient war replayed itself in miniature. A ritual reenactment of conquest, silence, resistance. So what did the oracle really channel? Perhaps not Apollo, not Gaia, but the conflict itself, the unresolved wound, the split in the soul of a civilization that no longer remembered its own shadow. And from that fissure, the truth slipped through, in riddles, in tremors, in breath. And sometimes, truth was the most dangerous thing of all. For those in power, ambiguity was useful, but only when controlled. A prophecy that could be interpreted many ways was a tool. A prophecy that could not be interpreted, or worse, that resisted interpretation, was a threat. And so the priests began to curate the voice more carefully.
They trained themselves not just in religion, but in rhetoric, law, and diplomacy. They built walls, not of stone but of meaning. They translated the tremble into decree. But the tremble was never theirs to command. In some eras, Delphi grew quiet. The rituals continued, the offerings flowed, but the power dulled. The oracle's voice no longer startled. Her trances became rehearsed, her responses formulaic. There were whispers that Apollo had grown distant, or perhaps it was the world that had stopped listening. The deeper the empire reached into foreign lands, the more it forgot its roots. And the more it forgot, the more the oracle's voice began to fade. Yet now and then, the old spirit stirred again. A new Pythia would rise, unexpected, untrained in subtlety, her body unable to pretend. And suddenly, the chamber would pulse again with the power no priest could script. There are fragments in dusty scrolls, second-hand accounts of prophecies that caused panic, visions of fire, collapse, reversal. Not the neat assurances of a god, but the raw howling of something that refused to be shaped. Was this failure or return? Because while the oracle was a religious institution, it was also a fault line, a place where the unconscious of a culture cracked open, just enough to let something spill through. Not divine command, but buried truth. The kind of truth we try not to hear until it is too late. One Pythia, legend says, fell silent after a vision so disturbing that no priest dared record it. She never spoke again. She wandered the temple in silence, her eyes full of something no one could face. They said the god had abandoned her, but others believed she had gone too deep, past Apollo, past Gaia, into a darkness older than language. Another, in the final days of the classical age, uttered a phrase that made rulers tremble. "The god is leaving this house." No one wanted to believe it. But not long after, the temple was sacked, the statues burned, the priesthood scattered. The empire too would fall. Prophecy did not die, but its voice changed. In time, the role of the Pythia became symbolic. Her rituals reenacted, her power displaced into books and councils. The deep breath over the chasm became metaphor. The question was no longer asked of the earth, but of the archive. Certainty replaced mystery. And so the oracle, once the navel of the world, became a ruin. But a ruin is never just a place. It is a memory, half buried, waiting. And even now, beneath the stones of Delphi, there is a silence that does not sleep. The crack remains. The air still carries the faint smell of laurel. And if you stand very still, some say you can feel it. A pulse in the rock, like a breath, waiting to be taken. Waiting for the question. Because the oracle was never just a woman, never just a priestess. She was the space between fear and knowledge, the breath before truth. And though the temple is fallen, the breath still waits. It waits not in the shattered altar, nor in the broken columns warmed by sunlight, but in us. For what was Delphi if not a mirror? Not only for kings and seekers long gone, but for anyone who has ever stood at a threshold, trembling. Anyone who has ever asked a question knowing the answer might undo them. The oracle's legacy did not end with the fall of the temple. It transformed. It moved inward. It became the architecture of the psyche. Carl Jung once called the Pythia a living symbol of the unconscious, a mouth through which the hidden spoke, her trembling, her riddles, her ecstatic surrender. All mirrored the journey into the self, into the shadow. The gods she channeled may have worn names like Apollo, but their true identity was more fluid. They were archetypes, energies, patterns etched into the collective human soul. In this light, the fumes that filled the Adyton were not just geological. They were metaphorical. The vapors of dream, myth, ancestral memory. The trance was not merely chemical, it was a descent. A ritualized breaking of the ego, allowing something older, deeper to surface. Not supernatural, but deeply, achingly natural. And what surfaced was never clear. That is the true terror of the oracle. Not that she might lie, but that she might show us what we already know and refuse to face. We do not go to the oracle for answers. We go to hear the question spoken aloud, in a voice we cannot ignore. We go to be undone, so that we may be remade. But in a world obsessed with certainty, such undoing became dangerous. Modernity has little patience for riddles. We want facts, data, linear thought. The Pythia would not last an hour in our age. Her cryptic phrases would be dissected, debunked, dismissed. Her tremors diagnosed. Her madness pathologized. Yet the longing she answered still remains, coiled in the heart of even the most rational mind. We still want to know. Will it work? Should I leave? What if I stay? Is this the right path? The language has changed, but the ache is the same. We ask algorithms now. We consult experts, scroll through advice columns, search engine queries, tarot cards, genetic reports. But behind each query, one thing lingers: the fear that what lies ahead may break us, that we are not ready, that we do not know how to choose. And so the oracle returns, not in stone temples, but in stories, in dreams, in the trembling moments before we act. The archetype of the Pythia lives on, the veiled voice within that disrupts, confounds, reveals, not as prediction, but as mirror. She is what speaks when we stop pretending to know. But to hear her now, we must descend without incense, without priests, without the rites of Delphi. We must enter our own inner chamber, dark, strange, cracked open by longing, and wait. Not for instruction, but for encounter. And when she speaks, it will not be in Greek, not in hexameter, not even in words. It may be a dream that won't let go, a phrase that echoes, a choice that haunts. It may be the body's tremble before truth. It may be the breath before a name is spoken. And when she does speak, she will not say what is coming. She will say what you already know, because prophecy was never about the future. It was always about the present moment, that thin, flickering line where everything might still change. And that is what makes her so unbearable, because we want comfort, not confrontation. We want a God to tell us what to do, not a mirror to show us who we are. The true oracle never tells, she reveals. And revelation is a dangerous gift. It strips away illusions. It unmasks the masks we didn't know we were wearing. It says, "Here, look," and there is no turning away. That is why prophecy was never a passive act. To visit the oracle was to enter a ritual of transformation. The pilgrim did not simply receive a message, they were changed by the very act of asking. The journey to Delphi was long, the rituals demanding, the waiting profound. And by the time the question was spoken aloud, it had already begun to dissolve. Because the question was never about the world. It was always about the self. The oracle was the threshold where the inner and outer met, where the fate of nations and the ache of the soul braided into one thread. Her answers came wrapped in symbols, because the truth they pointed to could not survive the light of logic. They had to be carried, contemplated, lived, and in that living, they unfolded.
Many sought to master the oracle, to make her words predictable, mechanical, obedient. But she remained elusive. The priests tried to systematize her, and later philosophers tried to interpret her through the lens of reason. Yet still, the Pythia slipped through their fingers. She belonged to another logic, the spiral, not the line, the dream, not the diagram. And perhaps that is why she endured. Even when her temple fell into ruin, her spirit persisted. Through the Sibyls of Rome, the mystics of Byzantium, the witches of the European forests, the seers of distant lands, always women, always veiled, always trembling before something too large to name. They carried her lineage, even if they never knew her name. What is a prophet, after all? Not a fortune teller, not a sage. A prophet is one who listens where others refuse, one who feels what others cannot name, a barometer of the age's inner weather. And when the pressure grows too heavy, when the soul of a people reaches breaking point, the prophet breaks first. She shakes, she cries, she rages, and in her madness, the world hears its own echo. This is the deeper mystery of the Pythia. She did not just speak for the gods. She spoke for the wound, the split in the soul between what is and what must be. And her voice, quaking with pain and power, carried the burden of both. That is why her answers were never easy. They were born from tension. They required interpretation because they came from the place before clarity, before choice, before the self had settled. And so, even in ruins, she remains. Not as nostalgia, but as a call to return to the sacred fissure, to sit above the trembling ground within us, to ask not for knowledge, but for truth, not for certainty, but for the courage to face what is already known. She waits there still, not in the temple, but in the threshold, in the breath before we leap. It is there that the true oracle lives, not in visions of distant wars or cryptic verses about forgotten kings, but in the moments when we are asked to become something more than we have been. The leap is never just an action. It is a surrender, a letting go of the map, the script, the identity so carefully worn. And in that surrender, the Pythia waits, whispering through the fissures of the psyche. Her voice is not instruction. It is invitation to descend, to listen, to dwell in that liminal space where old stories die and new ones have not yet been born. And this, perhaps, is what terrified the ancient world, and still terrifies us now. Not that the oracle might deceive, but that she might demand something real. A change, a transformation we did not plan for. Because the breath before the leap is not just stillness. It is pressure, the weight of everything that has brought us to the edge, the accumulated silence, the unanswered dreams, the shadowed desires we never dared speak aloud. The oracle does not create this pressure. She reveals it. She amplifies it. She breathes it back into our bones. And then she watches to see whether we will step forward or retreat. That is why her answers always felt like riddles. Not because they were meant to confuse, but because the truth they contained could only be unlocked by the one who asked. No two seekers ever heard the same meaning. Each prophecy bent itself around the soul that received it. The words were a doorway, but the key was always personal. Interpretation was not an act of intellect. It was an act of courage. So who were the ones who returned from Delphi changed? Not the ones who sought control or certainty or advantage, but those who were willing to be undone, to walk back into the world with the seed of something unknown growing inside them. They became poets, founders, reformers,
not because the oracle told them what to do, but because she revealed what was possible if they dared to listen. And yet, for every seeker who changed, there were many who turned away. Those who heard only what they wanted to hear, who took her words and bent them into justification, who used the voice of the god to sanctify conquest or cruelty or cowardice. And in this misuse, something inside the oracle dimmed. Her chamber remained open, her breath still rose, but the questions brought to her became smaller, safer, less about destiny, more about wealth. And the gods do not answer such questions for long. That may be why the chasm eventually closed. Not because the gods left, but because we stopped asking real questions, the kind that demand sacrifice, the kind that rearrange a life. But the chasm still exists, not in stone, but in self. It waits for those who dare descend, for those who still carry the echo of the old hunger, not for prediction, but for purpose, for a way of seeing the world that breaks open the known and reveals the mythic thread beneath.
And when they reach that place, that inner Adyton, the Pythia will be there, not as a ghost, but as a voice, a trembling within, a breath before becoming. Because she never belonged to Delphi alone. She belongs to every moment we stand at the edge of the world we have known and choose to leap. But what if we misunderstood her all along? What if the oracle was never a mouthpiece of divine will, never a tool of empire, never even a prophet in the way we imagine? What if she was a guardian, not of knowledge but of mystery, not of what can be said but of what must remain unsaid? It is tempting to think of the Pythia as a bridge to the gods, but perhaps she was something more disruptive, a protector of boundaries, a reminder that not all doors should open easily, that not all truths are meant to be known, and not all futures meant to be foreseen. In a world obsessed with visibility, the oracle was veiled, and in that veil there was protection for her and for us. Because what happens when we tear away all veils? We are left with exposure, with truths too raw to hold. The ancient world understood this in ways we have forgotten. They knew the danger of unmediated contact with the divine. That is why the oracle's chamber was hidden, the rituals so elaborate, the atmosphere thick with smoke and silence. The gods were not to be summoned lightly, nor were the shadows they dragged behind them. And yet, we have made a god of exposure. We demand clarity, transparency, instant access. We light up every corner, flatten every mystery. And in doing so, we have lost something vital, the ability to approach the unknown with reverence. We no longer kneel at the threshold. We barge through it, demanding answers. But the oracle never responded to demands, only to devotion. The true seeker approached in silence. And in that silence, something stirred. Not certainty, but vision. A glimpse, a thread, a dream fragment, too strange to dismiss. That is how prophecy really worked. Not as a map, but as a haunting. A seed that lived in the soul long after the words were spoken. A tension that refused to resolve. But prophecy, like myth, requires time. It must be carried, lived, allowed to unfold in layers. And when we refuse that unfolding, when we force clarity where there should be awe, the prophecy curdles. It becomes dogma, literalism, weapon, and the oracle, that living, trembling threshold, is silenced. That is the paradox of Delphi. It was the most sacred place in the ancient world, and yet it warned against too much knowing.
It honored the question more than the answer. It placed a woman over a chasm and asked her not to explain, but to feel, to tremble, to become. And through her, the world remembered how to listen. But now we listen differently. We scroll, we skim. We demand meaning without mystery. And in this frenzy, the old voice grows faint. Not gone, but harder to hear. Not because she has vanished, but because we have forgotten how to be still, how to be porous, how to be afraid in the right way. Because fear, too, is sacred. The trembling of the Pythia was not weakness. It was reverence, a physical response to something vast, invisible, unknowable. She did not conquer her fear. She entered it. She let it move through her. And in doing so, she revealed something we are only beginning to remember, that wisdom does not come from mastery, but from surrender. And maybe that is the truth we missed all along. The oracle was never about the gods. She was about the space between the question and the answer, and the power of not knowing. And that space has always been sacred, not just in temples or rituals, but in every moment when we hesitate, not out of weakness, but out of awe. When we feel that trembling in our chest before we speak a truth that could change everything. When we realize that the real threshold is not out there, in the marble ruins of Delphi, but within us. We are each a temple. Each of us carries a chasm, a crack in the certainty of the self, through which the deeper voice sometimes rises. And when it does, it doesn't shout. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or thunder. It hums, low and strange, like breath rising from beneath the earth. A feeling, a knowing that can't be reasoned, a truth we cannot trace, only follow. But in a world that rewards control, this kind of knowing is often dismissed. We call it irrational. We name it hysteria, intuition, fantasy. We exile the inner voice in favor of external authorities, experts, systems, institutions. We abandon the trembling girl on the tripod in favor of charts and policies. And yet, something in us still aches to return, to remember how to feel our way through the dark. This is not nostalgia. It is remembering what the ancients encoded in stone, that the deepest truths cannot be spoken, only enacted. That knowledge without transformation is hollow. That the body, in its trembling, sometimes knows what the mind cannot grasp. The oracle was a ritual of descent. Each visit, each question, each breath drawn over the sacred crack, it was a kind of dying, a letting go of the known world. And what emerged on the other side was not clarity, but contact. Not an answer, but an encounter with the self, with the mythic, with the invisible architecture that underlies all visible things. And that encounter left marks. Pilgrims who returned from Delphi were often changed. Some became obsessed. Some withdrew from public life. Some claimed to have seen the god, not in form, but in everything, in trees, in wind, in silence. Delphi did not just offer information. It altered perception. It rewrote the soul's language. But such transformation comes at a cost. That is why the Pythia was so carefully guarded, why the rites were so elaborate. They were not theater. They were protection, not from the gods, but from ourselves. Because to stand too long above the chasm without preparation is to risk falling in. And some did. Some never returned whole. Still, the line of Pythias endured. Across generations, women came to sit above the breathing stone. Each brought her body, her wounds, her dreams. And through them, the oracle spoke, not as one voice but as a chorus. Not from on high, but from below. Not as command, but as song. And though the temple is dust, the song continues. It echoes in the questions that won't leave us, in the choices that haunt, in the symbols that follow us through dreams, in every trembling before a leap. The oracle was never just history. She is a pattern, one that reemerges whenever we remember that knowing begins not with certainty, but with reverence. She waits in that breath, in the pause before we act, in the silence before the name, in the question that cannot be answered, but must still be asked. This is where prophecy becomes poetry, not because it is decorative, but because it is dangerous. Poetry, like the oracle, refuses to resolve, it dances instead. Around truth, within paradox, inside the cracks of certainty. It speaks in symbols because it must, because what it carries cannot be said directly, because the soul, like the gods, is shy and must be approached with metaphor, not command. The ancients knew this instinctively. They did not separate the sacred from the beautiful. A temple was not a lecture hall. It was a song made of stone. The oracle did not lecture. She shuddered. She wailed. She whispered in riddles. Her words were not explanations. They were incantations. They left the listener altered, not because they understood, but because they felt something rearrange inside them. That rearrangement was the point. Because prophecy was not about being right. It was about being real. It was not prediction. It was pattern recognition. The Pythia did not invent the future. She sensed it, ripening in the present. Her breath caught it. Her voice released it. But it was never hers. She was not a prophetess of control. She was a vessel of becoming. And becoming is never clean. It breaks. It burns. It questions what we thought was solid. The trembling that overtook the oracle was not theatrical. It was the body cracking open under the weight of the unsaid, the unspeakable, the not yet known. That is why she had to be veiled. Not to hide, but to contain. Not to mystify, but to protect herself and those who listened. But what happens when we lift the veil too soon? We risk mistaking mystery for madness. Many did. Even in ancient times, the Pythia was both revered and feared. Some accused her of delirium, of fraud, of being a puppet. Others saw in her the eruption of something primal, something the rational mind could not dominate. The very thing that civilization was built to suppress. That thing has many names. The unconscious, the feminine, the earth, the serpent, the wound, the source. It is what the gods once were, before they became marble. It is what the oracle channels even now, even in absence. Not a doctrine, a current, a pulse beneath the skin of time. And if we are quiet enough, we can still feel it. Not in the voice of a god, but in the silence after a dream. The hesitation before a vow. The ache that rises when we're about to leave something behind. The tremor of recognition when a symbol finds us. The sense, fleeting, unmistakable, that we are not alone in our knowing. That is when the Pythia returns. Not in body, but in form. Not as a figure in a temple, but as a presence within. The guardian of thresholds. The keeper of questions. The whisperer of truths we do not yet know we carry. And when she speaks, it is not to guide, but to awaken. She does not tell us what to believe. She reminds us that belief is a doorway, not a destination. That faith is not certainty, but surrender. That to live as a seeker is to live in the perpetual unfolding of the riddle. That riddle is not a test. It is a blessing. It means the breath still waits. It waits in the hollow spaces of the world and of the self. In the pause before a decision. In the shadow between memory and meaning. in the aching quiet after something beloved has ended, but before something new has begun. These are the modern Delphis, the invisible temples of transformation. We do not build them with stone anymore, we become them. We carry the crack within. Each of us walks with a fissure in the soul, a place we dare not look too closely into. And yet, that is where the voice rises. The whisper beneath the noise, the rhythm behind the thought. The oracle, after all, never belonged only to history. She is a function of the human condition, a symbol of the sacred pause before becoming. But we have been taught to rush, to run from silence, to fill every moment, numb every tremor, distract from every question that does not offer an immediate answer. And in that haste, something essential slips away. Not just beauty, not just presence, but prophecy, the capacity to stand still in the face of the unknown and allow it to speak. That was the Pythia's true genius, not her visions, not her voice, but her willingness to stand at the edge of the world and not flinch, to surrender her body to the sacred riddle, to bear, within her trembling frame, the unbearable truth that becoming is always a form of death, the death of what we were, the death of certainty, the death of control, and through that death, revelation. This is what the empires never understood, why their temples crumbled while the myth endured. Because you cannot conquer what lives in the breath, you cannot own what flows from the threshold. The oracle could be silenced, exiled, even forgotten, but she could not be erased. Because the question never dies. What is to come? What am I? What must I lose to become whole? These questions haunt every soul brave enough to stop pretending. And when we ask them, truly ask them, and we invoke the old rites, not with incense, but with presence, not with gold offerings, but with attention. The same gods who once listened at Delphi listen still, but they speak only through silence, through trembling, through the voice that is not ours, but speaks from within us. And so we must learn again how to tremble, how to listen not for answers, but for invitations, how to sit above the crack and breathe, how to let the vision come, not from books or screens, but from the marrow, from the night, from the part of us that remembers what the world has forgotten, that there is wisdom in uncertainty and power in surrender. The Pythia did not predict the future. She opened the present. And in doing so, she made space for a future that was not dictated by fear or habit or force. She cracked time open. She said, "Behold, the moment is alive." And in that moment, anything could happen. Not because she knew, but because she didn't. That is the final paradox of prophecy. It is not the art of knowing what comes next. It is the sacred practice of meeting the unknown with reverence. And reverence begins with remembering. Not remembering facts or dates, but remembering how to feel, how to kneel, if only inwardly, before something we cannot grasp, how to soften the mind until it listens like the body does, instinctively, intuitively, without needing to explain. The Pythia did not speak from knowledge. She spoke into mystery. That was her power, and her burden, because it cost her. The trembling was real. The rupture was real. To sit at the edge of a chasm, day after day, inhaling the breath of the earth, surrendering to a voice that may or may not come. That is not ceremony. That is sacrifice. We forget that prophecy has always demanded the body. That vision does not come without cost. And yet, she gave herself. Each Pythia, across generations, entered the sacred smoke, not as an oracle, but as a woman, with fears, with doubts, with memories of her mother's hands and the way wind bends through olive trees. And it was that humanness that made her a vessel, not despite it, but because of it. The divine never descends where the human has not opened. That is the oldest secret, encoded in every myth. The god speaks through the one who is willing to be broken, who makes of herself an altar, who carries no armor, only awe. And Delphi was not a place to be armored. It stripped you. It silenced you. And in that silence, something else, something older, began to speak. Perhaps that is why the oracle has been erased so carefully, not by fire, but by forgetting, by misremembering her as a relic, a curiosity, a footnote to empires. But she was never marginal. She was the center, not just geographically, but cosmically. Delphi was the omphalos, the navel of the world, and from that navel, the world breathed. And what it exhaled was a woman waiting, listening, becoming voice. But voice was not the end of it. The real work began after the words were spoken, after the prophecy was heard, because every answer from Delphi was a beginning, not a conclusion. And what followed was a life lived in dialogue with mystery. Some resisted it, some denied it. But those who allowed themselves to be reshaped by the oracle became something new. Not rulers, not heroes, witnesses. Witnesses to a deeper rhythm, one not bound by conquest or coin, but by connection. To the land, to the dream, to the question that will not die. These were the quiet revolutionaries. Not the ones who shouted truth, but the ones who carried it, who bore it like a flame in cupped hands, even as the winds of time tried to extinguish it. And that flame still burns, in art, in grief, in ritual, in the sudden tears that rise when a song says something we did not know we needed to hear. In the dreams we wake from trembling, in the silence that sometimes falls when we are about to speak, and realize that the words must wait, because something older is listening, and perhaps through us, waiting to speak. But what if she already has? What if the oracle has never gone silent, only changed her voice? What if she now speaks, not in riddles from beneath the earth, but through the patterns of our own unraveling, through the disquiet, the dreams, the moments when the world no longer makes sense? We call it crisis. The ancients called it visitation. For prophecy is not a message from far away. It is the arrival of what we've tried not to hear. The world is full of modern temples, digital, concrete, conceptual, but few sacred thresholds. Few places where the rupture is welcomed, where trembling is honored. And yet, the tremble is everywhere. In our climate, our culture, our inner lives. We are living in the breath before the leap, as a species, as a planet. And the oracle speaks again, not to predict what will happen, but to ask, are you listening? Are you willing to be undone? Are you brave enough to feel? In an age obsessed with building, perhaps prophecy has returned to teach us how to fall, how to descend with dignity, how to crack open, not shatter, how to die, not disappear. Because the leap is not always forward. Sometimes it is downward, into the root, into the wound, into the silence we've buried under centuries of noise. The Pythia was never a guide to the stars. She was a guide to the underworld. Her breath did not rise from heaven. It rose from the earth, from the place beneath places. And in following it, we were never promised escape, only encounter. This is the paradox. The oracle leads us not out of the labyrinth, but deeper into it. Not toward clarity, but toward complexity. She is not a solution. She is a solvent. A force that dissolves false boundaries, easy answers, neat divisions. She calls the soul back to wholeness, which means to heartbreak, to contradiction, to the radiant mess of being. And that mess is sacred because it is real. Because it is what the gods recognized in us when they first learned to speak through flesh. Not perfection, but presence. Not purity, but power. The kind that comes from being utterly, exquisitely human. The oracle was a woman. This was never incidental. It mattered that she bled, that she aged, that she was chosen not at the peak of youth, but often in her years of ripeness, of knowing, of loss. Her body was not a blank slate. It was a vessel carved by time. And through it, the gods poured not answers, but echoes. Echoes of something only she could midwife. And perhaps that is the final twist. That the oracle was never there to tell us anything. She was there to show us what it means to listen, to ourselves, to the earth, to the parts of each other we refuse to name. She was the silence at the center of every scream, the question behind every dogma, the pause before every transformation. And she waits still, in us, through us, as us. Because the oracle was never a role, it was a state, a condition of being radically open, willing to feel the tremors of the world move through your own bones, willing to be undone, reshaped, reformed by forces too vast to name. It is not a job, it is a threshold. And anyone who dares step across it, whether in temple or field, in heartbreak or vision, becomes, if only for a moment, an oracle too. We are taught to fear this, to fear ambiguity, emotion, madness, unknowing, to label it instability, to exile the very qualities through which the sacred speaks. But the Pythia was not stable. She was not still. She was not safe. And in her trembling she held the axis of the world. There is a reason she sat at the center. Delphi was not simply the navel of the earth. It was the pulse point of myth, of psyche, of the collective unconscious. And from that place, the oracle did not give commandments. She invited reflection. She held up a mirror, not to our power, but to our limits. She said, "Look not only forward, but inward." And the echoes of that mirror remain. In every moment we feel a truth we cannot yet speak. In every impulse to break a pattern we were told was permanent. In every act of art that channels what logic cannot touch. The oracle lives there, in the soul's refusal to settle, in the body's wisdom, in the courage it takes to feel what others deny. The world is changing, not in the way we expect, not through revolution or revelation, but through the slow, tectonic shifting of awareness. We are being asked again to listen. To listen not just to data or discourse or dogma, but to the trembling beneath. To listen to the questions that wake us in the night, the ache in the collective chest, the yearning for something older than certainty. That yearning is the new temple. It requires no stone, only silence, only surrender, only a willingness to sit beside the crack in our own stories and breathe. Because the gods, if they speak now, will not shout. They will come as intuition, as poetry, as rupture, as dreams we cannot shake. And we will have to learn, as the ancients once knew, that the truest truths do not arrive fully formed. They arrive wrapped in symbols, in paradox, in riddles that reflect the shape of our own souls. And when they do, we must become still enough to receive them. Like the Pythia, like the trembling woman on the tripod, who never claimed to own the truth, only to carry it for a moment before releasing it back into the world. This is what remains. Not the temple, not the flame, not even the name, but the practice of listening, of surrendering, of becoming the breath that speaks between the worlds. Thank you for walking with me through the hidden corridors of myth, memory, and mystery, for tracing the breath of the oracle through smoke, silence, and time. This was more than a history. It was a remembering. Each story I tell seeks to reawaken what has not been lost, only buried, beneath centuries, beneath noise, beneath the skin of the everyday. If you feel the whisper of something stirring, I invite you to stay on this journey with me. Subscribe to Forgotten Lore, to follow where the myths lead next, through forest and fire, through ruin and rebirth. Until then, keep listening. The breath still waits.